Off here. Welcome back. Just a reminder, next Tuesday we have a special guest coming in, Richard Gingras, who is the VP of News at Google, and he's going to be giving an evening talk on media and trust. So everybody's welcome to do that, to come to that, and it's in Packard?
Packard 101.
Packard 101. So put that on your calendar. And today I'm happy to welcome Arvind Satyanayaran, who will talk to us about innovations in data visualizations. Arvind is currently a postdoc research scientist at Google Brain. He received his PhD here at Stanford, and he worked with Jeff Hare, who moved to University of Washington, and so Arvind also was part of the UW Interactive Data Lab. Next fall, he will be joining the faculty at MIT as an assistant professor. Congratulations.
Thank you.
In his research, he is interested in developing new interactive data visualization models that describe what a visualization should look like rather than how it should be computed. Systems he has developed have won awards at premier academic venues, and are used by Wikipedia and the Jupyter Python data science communities. Today he will introduce a new visualization toolkit, Vega Lite, and describe the opportunities it enables for new interactive data analysis systems. So join me in welcoming Arvind.
Thank you for that introduction, Ann, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be back at Stanford. Vega Lite, we just released it actually about a week ago. So this is pretty fresh stuff. Even though the affiliations here are a little bit old, this is a bunch of work that I did over my PhD. So data visualization has gone mainstream, from business intelligence to data-driven journalism. We as a society have really come to embrace it as a medium for recording, analyzing, and communicating really complex data sets. But to understand why it's seen such explosive growth recently, I wanted to start by diving into a couple of examples. So imagine that I had data for a couple 100,000 flights across the country, and for each of these flights I had the day and time that they took off, their source and destination cities, the distance that they flew, and the arrival delay that they might have experienced at their destination. So one thing I could do with all of this data is just dive right into it, right? I could start visualizing it in a whole number of different ways. But it's often good to start by taking a step back and visualizing the distribution of the data to get an overview of it. And a common way of doing that is through the use of histograms. So here we're seeing the data along those dimensions I mentioned: time of day, arrival delay, distance, and the date. And even at this very high level, a number of interesting insights emerge. So for example, with the day of the week, we see this weekly repeating pattern where there are fewer flights on weekends. That might match our intuition. With time of day, we see that activity in airports really sort of takes off at about 6 a.m., but it's really those evening periods between 6 and 9 p.m. that are the busiest. With arrival delay, this might be actually a surprising result. Most flights seem to get to their destination on time, right? That peak of that distribution is right around 0 minutes, with maybe a 5 to 10 minute margin of error. And certainly that surprised me when I first looked at this histogram. And finally, looking at the distance, we see the effect of sort of hub and spoke travel in the United States. Right? Most flights seem to fly between 200 to 400 miles, even though we know that the United States is much larger than that. So even at this high level, like I said, some interesting insights emerge. But once we begin to interact with the data, we're able to sort of amplify the set of insights we can generate from it. So this is a technique called cross-filtering. When I drag out a region of interest in one of the histograms and I move that region around, the bars in all the other histograms re-aggregate to show just that depicted region. And as I move that brush back and forth, we can see a number of different insights. So with arrival delay, we can see that there's this sort of knock-on effect throughout the day, right? These delays seem to accumulate, and you can see, that correlation with time of day on the side there. So the longer delays occur later in the day. But the same interaction also shows me a correlation with distance. So as I move that region to those negative arrival delays, you'll notice that this bar for about 2,000 miles really spikes. So what's going on there? Well, one hypothesis might be that maybe airlines are just really good at making up time in the air, right? They experience a long delay, they've got a lot of space, maybe they just put things in high gear. But if you're like me, maybe you're a little bit cynical about these airlines, and I think they're just giving themselves a much wider margin of error for those long flights, right? They're saying that it's actually going to take them much longer than it does. And so interactions like this allow us to take a step beyond those static visualizations. And beyond these sort of data analysis tasks, journalists have also been using interactive data visualizations to communicate complex data sets to their audiences. So this is an example from the New York Times by Amanda Cox. It's maybe not as sophisticated as some of the interactives we see online today, but it remains one of my favorites because of how the story unfolds. So this is a narrative visualization comparing budget forecasts that various administrations have and comparing them against reality. And so Amanda takes us step by step through these various years, layers over different annotations, and shows us that almost always various administrations have been much more optimistic about their budget forecasts than reality has panned out. And what's nice about this is once that narrative arc completes, the visualization opens up for more free-form exploration, and we can drag this slider down at the bottom and look at the budget surpluses we ended up with right around the year 2000, something like $500 billion of surplus. We were projected to have even more by 2011, and we all know how that panned out. So my work over my PhD has been focused on enabling people to build visualizations of this caliber, and I've really focused on these new models or programming languages for interactive visualization. And the models that I've developed have had two main goals. So the first is to lower the threshold or the amount of technical expertise people require to build visualizations like the ones we've seen. And the second is something that I call the systematic analysis of the design space. And this sounds a little sophisticated, but we'll see what that means. And really what it means is making it easy for us to go from one point in the design space to another in a fairly rigorous, thorough way. So we know that we're building the best visualization that we can. And my work builds on the current state of the art for visualization, D3, which I'm guessing a lot of us might be familiar with. So you can think of D3 as a visualization kernel. It provides a number of useful utilities for us for visualization design that we build on. And the first project that I'll talk about is called Vega. And it offers what is known as a full declarative language for interactive visualization. So it offers building blocks for both the visual encoding side of things and the interaction. And critically, it enables a really expressive design space. So I can construct a wide variety of different visualizations using Vega. Now, building on top of Vega is Vega Lite, the language that Anne mentioned. It is a much more concise specification language. And really our goal here is to enable a much more rapid authoring process and some of that systematic enumeration I talked about earlier. Now, both Vega and Vega Lite provide representations of visualizations that make it easy for us to build these new systems for interactive data analysis and design. And we've been really excited to see a wide ecosystem developing around these tools, including deployments on Wikipedia and with the Jupyter community. And I've also explored this space with a system called Lyra. And with Lyra, we're sort of trying to figure out what might an Adobe Illustrator for data visualization look like. Now, underlying all of this work is this principle of declarative specification. So my work describes what the visualization should look like, rather than requiring users to specify low-level details about how the computation might occur. Now, why do we care about this? Well, first of all, it allows users to focus on design. So as a user, I can not only iterate more quickly on a single particular design, but I can also much more thoroughly explore the space of all possible designs. And because we're moving design to this more higher level process, I would argue that it makes it accessible to a much wider audience, right? I need a lot less technical expertise. Second, the system handles all the execution details. So this includes things like data processing, rendering, animation, so on and so forth. And as a result, because the system is entirely responsible for that, it can perform a number of optimizations to the computation completely unbeknownst to me, the user. And finally is this notion of reuse and portability. So I can write a single declarative specification and then at runtime reapply it with different input data or even retarget it across different devices. So the same specification would render on the desktop, on my touch devices. I don't have to change anything about it at all. And a lot of these properties of declarative specification we've seen in other domains, right? So if you've done any amount of web design, you've used declarative languages, HTML, CSS, and so forth. If you do any work with databases, SQL is another example of this, right? A very declarative specification. We're just saying, this is what I want from my database. This is the query I wish to execute. I'm not telling you exactly how to execute that query. And in visualization, declarative specifications of visual encodings have been well studied. So of course, we start with our raw input data. And a common one here that a lot of folks like to use is the iris data set. How many of us are familiar with iris? How many of us have seen it? OK, not that many hands. So what this data set is just one of these canonical example data sets. And it contains measurements for the sepals and petals for 3 different species of these iris flowers. So you can see the sepal and petal widths and lengths, as well as the species identified just in a table. And so the core operation in visualization is to take these raw data values and map them to visual properties like position, color, and size. And so to simplify that mapping operation, another building block that we often use are these scale functions. So say I wanted to build a scatter plot. Well, I would need an x scale to take these petal widths and map them to x coordinates. I would need a y scale to take these sepal lengths and map them to y coordinates. And then maybe I want to color the points based on their species, and so I need a color scale for that as well. Guides like axes and legends help us visualize the scales. And then finally are these marks, which are really what we think of when we think of visualization. Those are those data representative graphics. And in the case of a scatter plot, we probably want to use these symbol marks, and voila, there we go. There is a single scatter plot. Now, what's interesting about this iris data set is that it's a multivariate data set, right? We've got a whole different number of different dimensions. And while the scatter plot usefully gives us just a single correlation in our data set, it would be useful to see all those correlations in concert at the same time in the scatter plot matrix. And so to go from that single scatter plot to this matrix here, we need some additional data. So what fields are we interested in correlating? And then we need to transform that data to essentially calculate a cross product of those fields. And most visualization languages offer a whole plethora of these transforms, things to filter data, sort data, aggregate data, so on and so forth. Now, a common interaction with the scatterplot matrix is this interaction I'm showing here called brushing and linking. So it's similar to the one we saw earlier. I drag out a region of interest in one of the cells of the histogram of the scatterplot matrix, and points that fall within that region highlight in all the other cells as well. And so that allows me to draw interesting comparisons across cells. So this is the canonical D3 example, and while we used declarative primitives for the visual encoding, the interaction is actually happening through all this JavaScript code that's executing here. What's happening are, we're basically tracking when the user presses down their mouse, when they move their mouse, and when they lift their mouse, and we're tracking all of that and computing a whole bunch of state. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, let's zoom into some of this code and take a closer look. So the first problem is that this is a very inconsistent notation, right? With interaction, we're suddenly exposing all these execution details that otherwise we'd hid when we were thinking about just how to map our data to visual encodings. Second, all the state associated with this interaction, so where is the brush, what is the size of that region, how to highlight points, all of that information has to be manually computed by the user, maintained, updated, and so forth. And so the first time I actually put these slides together, I made a mistake with that state calculation, and my interaction was all funky. Like, wrong points were being highlighted, my brush never stopped brushing and moving, and that was all because it fell to me as the user to maintain that state. And finally, there's this computer science notion called side effects, where the changes I'm introducing to my visualization are happening separately. So there are now multiple code paths that I have to look at to figure out how to start debugging this interaction or why my visualization might look a particular way. Now, all of these I would classify as sort of usability issues with this sort of imperative specification, but there are some deeper issues with the representation itself. So the first is, how might we analyze the interaction semantics, or what is the space of possible alternative designs? Now, this might sound like a purely academic exercise, but the reason we care is that we want to start building tools with more smarts baked in. Right? We want to be able to suggest good interaction techniques that might be most appropriate for the task at hand or for a particular visualization. And for that, we need to be, for our computer systems need to be able to, reason about some of these questions. And so, I'll start walking us through the various projects, starting at the lowest level here with Vega. And so because we're at the foundation of the stack here, what we care about is enabling a very expressive design space. I want to be able to construct a whole different diverse range of visualizations. And so our key insights here are that we want to model user input as streaming data. And if we do so, we'd be able to reuse a number of techniques from the academic literature, in particular from these reactive languages that maybe some of you that have been doing some web development have been hearing a lot about. So the high-level bit here is that when an event occurs, so something like a mouse click or a mouse move or something like that, interactive state is now automatically recomputed, and the visualization is automatically re-rendered. I, as the user, no longer have to do any of that manually. So let's unpack these concepts in a little more detail. So here are the declarative visual encoding primitives I'd walked through earlier. And alongside those, Vega introduces these event streams. So imagine that I had a bar chart and I move my mouse over the bars. What I would observe are these stream of mouse move events that occur on rectangle marks. To be able to specify these event streams, Vega also introduces an event selector syntax. So these are very similar to CSS selectors. To specify a stream of mouse move events, I just go ahead and say mouse move. And I can optionally declare the source of these events, so in this case, rectangle marks. And what's really great about these event streams and the event selector syntax is that now sequencing and composing these events in complicated ways becomes really trivial. So say that I wanted to capture all the drags that occurred on my visualization. Well, one way to model the stream of drag events is to say that there are mouse moves that occur between a mouse down and a mouse up. And for those of us who have done this in that old imperative model, you know that this takes several different event callbacks, a lot of code, just to be able to track this one simple thing: am I dragging my mouse or not? And now with Vega, we've boiled it down to just this selector syntax here. And now, alongside event streams, we also introduce these signals. So you can think of signals as just dynamic variables that recalculate whenever an event stream fires. So imagine we had a min coordinate signal, and it was backed by these mouse down events. And what we use that signal to do is just extract the x and y position that those mouse down positions occurred. And that's basically what signals are. Now, by default, because they're just inheriting from these event streams, those values, so these x and y values, are in visual or pixel space, right? They're coordinates on my screen. But usually what we want with our visualizations is to be able to define that interaction in data space. And that makes it easy to take that interaction and apply it to a whole different number of visualizations that might be anywhere on my screen. I don't know what their x and y positions are. So just like we have scale functions to take those data and map them to visual properties, we take scale inversions to invert that process. And so we can go from our min coordinate signal, invert it through a scale, and get a min datum signal out in return. Now, the last part of this process is to take these signals and actually build some sort of query with them. And that's what these predicate functions give us. So imagine that we had a min and max datum signal. A predicate function could say, select all the points that fall within that bounding box. And then the final step is to take that predicate and actually do something with it. So we can say, color all the points that fall within that bounding box in gold and leave the rest gray. And so if you squint a little, well, this is the brushing and linking interaction that we saw a few slides back, right? We drag out a region, highlight those points, and leave the rest in gray. And just with these declarative primitives, like I said, we're able to create a whole diverse range of visualizations. And so this is just a sampling of the ones that not only we've created, but our community of users has created as well. And I want to call your attention to down here, the cross-filtering interaction that I started with, and Amanda Cox's budget forecast example up there. And a couple here are really interesting. So this one was created by a member in our user community and is visualizing sort of the shot charts of different NBA players. And this has become a very popular sort of visualization technique in the NBA. And along the left there is, right here, is a technique from sort of Hans Rosling's style of narrative visualization. On the bottom, we've got the fertility of a number of countries and life expectancy along the top, and they're colored by their continent. And what's interesting about this technique is when you hover over a point, it's a little faint here, but you see that point's trajectory through time. So you can grab that point and move it along that trajectory to move all your data points in concert as well. And so that was a research prototype that folks at the University of Ontario built. They had to do it in their own custom purpose, 1,000-line code library, and we were able to redo it, in just a few hundred lines with Vega. So what are the advantages of specifying interaction techniques in this way? Well, the first, as that slide showed, is a really high expressive ceiling. We're able to do a lot of things in this language. But more importantly, users can focus on interaction design. So we no longer have to maintain any state ourselves, and these signals provide an abstraction barrier that simplify retargeting our interaction techniques. So here is that mid-coordinate signal from earlier. And what I can do is just go ahead and swap out the event streams that I'm using without affecting any of that downstream application logic at all. And so we've gone, from saying this interaction is just supported on the desktop to also extending it to touch devices by really making just a single line change to our specification. We don't have to rethink our whole interaction technique at all. And finally, there are the performance implications. So because Vega is entirely responsible for all execution details, it does a number of optimizations to that processing. And here are just some benchmark studies that we had run. These are now several years old. So actually, the green Vega line is far, far higher than the purple D3 line for the modern Vega architecture that we have. But really, that's the relationship that we care about, that Vega is so much faster. And this red dotted line here is the threshold below which users start to notice lags and jitters. And what you can see is, D3 falls below that line significantly earlier than Vega. Perhaps here most dramatically, Vega is still powering past 10,000 points when D3 has fallen well below that at about 6,000 or 7,000. Now, given these advantages, I would say that Vega primitives are still too low level, right? So you need to understand all these event streams and signals, how to wire them up, what reactive semantics are, and that requires a fair amount of expertise. And moreover, it's really difficult to analyze this design space. I get one interactive visualization. What are the tweaks I can make to get to another point in the design space and things like that? And so to better address these questions, we move up the stack now to Vega Lite. And Vega Lite, the question at this level is, what are higher level abstractions for our interaction? And in order to consider this question, we're trading some of that expressivity at the Vega level for gains in concision. So much more smaller language that we can specify more rapidly. And why do we care about that? Well, if you've got less to write, then you've got less to think about. And if you've got less to think about, well then you don't have to be as much of an expert in this field to be able to build these interactive visualizations. And similarly, if there's less to write, well then you can write it much more quickly. And that process is particularly critical for the early stages of design when you're just prototyping out some ideas that you might have. Or if you're a data scientist and you're doing exploratory data analysis, you're not spending a whole lot of time crafting the most perfect interactive visualization of all time. You're just producing something that you want to analyze and move on with. And so this final step is limiting that language vocabulary to make it easier for us to really analyze the space of designs and figure out what the alternatives are. And so the way we go about doing this is by identifying design patterns that we saw recurring in Vega and encapsulating them in reusable building blocks in Vega Lite. And any ambiguities that this process might introduce, we resolve with smart defaults. So let's make this a little more concrete. Here are those visual encoding primitives in Vega. And in Vega Lite, we take 3 of them, scales, guides, and marks, and we put them in these new things called encoding channels. So here is the simplest Vega Lite specification. As you can see, it's just a JSON object. And what we're doing is we're specifying, I want to make sure I don't trip here. We're specifying the source of our data, a particular mark, so in this case circles, and then we're just specifying those mappings between data fields, so horsepower, and visual variables like X, Y, and color. And these type annotations here are just indicating what data type that field is. So Q for quantitative, N for nominal, so on and so forth. And this is all it takes for Vega Lite to produce this scatter plot. What's actually happening is underneath the hood, the Vega Lite compiler is producing this full-blown Vega specification. And you can really see sort of the gains in concision that we've had here, because the only way I was able to fit all this blue code on the slide is by condensing a large portion of it behind these ellipses. And so we're talking about sort of an order of magnitude more concise. And so how are we able to do that? Well, we're omitting a lot of these low-level details, things like scale types and axes and legends and things like that, and having Vega Lite automatically figure out the thing that makes the most sense. So in this case, for example, we're saying we're plotting 2 quantitative fields together. Vega Lite goes, the best visualization for 2 quantitative fields is a scatter plot, and that's the default it gives us. But of course, as users, we might know a little better, or we might want to make some customizations. And so, of course, you can go in and just override those defaults in place. You can say, instead of that default color palette, here, use these different colors instead. Now, there's a lot to say about visual encodings, but I'd want to focus on the interaction techniques. And so let's look at how we enable that in Vega Lite. So here are Vega's visual encoding interaction building blocks. And in Vega Lite, we take 4 of them now, event streams, signals, scale inversions, and predicates, and we wrap them in this new thing called a selection. So the simplest definition of a selection is shown here. It's just a name, in this case picked, and a type, here single. And a simple way we might use that is to drive just a very simple if-then-else rule, right? So if a point is in that selection, color it using its origin field, and if it's not, leave it in gray. And what that selection is doing is providing defaults for all those Vega primitives we saw earlier. So things like event processing. So by default, selection here is selected on click. And the predicate rule. So we're saying, just a single point that we clicked on, just highlight that. Now, besides a single selection, we also have a multi-selection to be able to select multiple points. So the first point gets selected on click, and additional points get selected on shift click. Now, just with visual encodings, we can override these defaults. So we can say, instead of clicks, select these points on mouse hover. And so this produces this very sort of interesting paintbrushing effect. As you move your mouse over the visualization, those points get highlighted. That might be a useful way of maybe drawing some attention to a particular point in the visualization. Now, if the problem with this approach, though, is if as a user I had to go in and sort of override things all the time, that would be a pretty tedious process. And so in addition to selections, we also introduce these selection transformations. And so as the name might suggest, what we're doing is transforming some part of the selection in a particular way. So again, let's look at some examples. And by default here, you might remember that when we clicked, we just selected a single point at a time. But we might have a question of, well, there's this trend I observe here with horsepower and miles per gallon. And how might the number of cylinders a car has play into this trend? So what we can do is invoke a new transformation called the project transformation and say that actually I just want the selection to select points that share the same number of cylinders rather than just the point that I clicked. And so now you can see if I click a single point, all other points that have the same number of cylinders get highlighted as well. And as I click back and forth, you can see these interesting trends emerge where, the 3-cylinder cars are right up on one side and the, 5 and 6-cylinder cars all the way in the middle, and then the 8 at the end. The thing that you can do with these transformations is start to build them up in really interesting ways. So that interaction we saw, well, I had to click cylinders one at a time, and I was kind of just clicking randomly. I didn't get a sense of how thoroughly am I exploring my data set. And so in addition, we've got another transformation called a bind transformation that gives us these sliders that we can drag back and forth. And as you drag back and forth, you can see, great, now I'm being much more rigorous in my search process, and I can see actually, there were a couple of car cylinders in there that only had 1 or 2 points. There was not really a high probability that I would have actually clicked and found those points instead, but with the slider, those pop right out. And as I mentioned, these specifications are much more concise. And so that means it's very easy for me to rapidly generate and evaluate hypotheses. So now with just a couple of additional lines of code, I'm looking at, how might this trend that I've observed also change over time? And so as I drag that year slider back and forth, I can see that actually it looks like, those points are moving up the scatter plot, sort of indicating that, the newer the car, the more efficient it's getting, which is probably the right sort of trend that we want to see. Now, besides these discrete selections, we also have a selection that gives us a continuous form of interaction. So this is just the brushing interaction that I've always shown you, but this time in Vega Lite with this interval selection type. And of course, all our transformations work here as well. So we can use that project transform to restrict it just to a single dimension. And I can use that bind transform, but this time binding it to my scale functions. Now this doesn't generate sliders. Any ideas about what it might do? What might binding an interval selection to scale transforms do? This is what it does. It allows me to start panning my scatter plot instead. And why is that? Well, what's happening is that there's a two-way binding being established between the selection and the scale functions. And so when I manipulate the selection, the scale functions, the scale domains in particular, are changing as well. And so I move that selection back and forth. I'm manipulating my scale functions as well. But all the interactions I've shown you so far have just been sort of restricted to the single scatter plot. And yet all of the really compelling examples from before involved multiple different visualizations being coordinated together. And so while there's not an analogy to Vega, Vega Lite also has these view composition operators. So things like layering to take individual views and put them one on top of another. Concatenation to put views side by side. A repeat operator to do that concatenation but in a sort of data-driven way. And then finally facet to just split apart my data and generate one view for each of those partitions. Now what's important about these operations is that they form an algebra. So what this means is I can take the output of two of them and feed them into the operators themselves. And in that way I can build these really complex dashboards just by layering and concatenating these views together. So what that means concretely is that I can go from this single brushing scatterplot example to a scatterplot matrix just by introducing that repeat operator. And so this is an interaction technique that we saw way back with D3, and it required all that JavaScript code that you might remember me scrolling past. And now what we've done is just boil it down to these tens of lines of declarative code. No JavaScript at all, no sort of low-level execution details. And even at this high level, we're able to generate a lot of diverse examples. So besides that brushing and linking, we can also pan and zoom in that scatter plot. We can do an overview plus detail visualization. So if I brush an interval in the top, I see those points at a higher resolution at the bottom. I can interactively renormalize time series data. So here are stock prices for a variety of companies. And as I move my mouse cursor back and forth, that's what that red vertical line is. Those time series renormalize, showing me my return on interest at that particular point in time. And then perhaps the example we're most proud of is a variant of that cross-filtering example that I started off with, but this time the bars fill in gold to show the area that I'm filtering. And we actually think this is somewhat superior to that initial example because now you have the context of your overall data, right? You're not seeing the bars dance around, you're seeing them fill up. And so you know what portion of the data you're currently interacting with. You know, I want to highlight that all of these examples, I'm talking about tens of lines of JSON, maybe not even 10. So you know, very, very concise, very easy to create. Kind of scooping myself here. So very low threshold. You know, you don't need to understand these reactive semantics and all that stuff I was talking about with Vega. And all these custom and common techniques are expressible. Vega Lite takes care of, you know, wiring up all those low-level details for you. And perhaps more interestingly at this level, for the researcher in me, we can start to think about these interactive semantics. So how many points are being selected? How are they being selected? On click, on hover, with widgets, and in particular, what is the data query that we're specifying? And this is important because it allows us to rapidly explore the design space. So we already saw that we could go from just you know, a single brushing interaction to a panning interaction with this one additional line of code. But this is just one step in a much broader space of possible interactive visualizations that we can now start to systematically construct with Vega Lite. And so what I'm showing here is starting at the top left-hand corner there with our single static scatter plot. Each of these arrows is just making a single change to our specification, right? One line of code or something like that. And in each case, we're generating a pretty different visualization, right? We go from selecting a single point to selecting you know, number of cylinders, to hovering, to a scatter plot matrix through our sliders here on the side. And this is really sort of a systematic enumeration of the design space. And this is important because, you know, not only can our software systems begin to reason about this space, but as users, we can now start to manually walk this graph and start to get a sense of, well, is this the best visualization possible for my particular task, or can I make a single change and get somewhere better? Now, as I mentioned, these systems are enabling new software applications for analysis and design, one of which my colleagues at the UW Interactive Data Lab have already been building, called Voyager. And Voyager is a tool for data analysts, and the goal is really to enable a very broad exploratory process. Because what we found is you know, a lot of folks tend to get overly focused very early in their exploration process. They sort of dive deep down a particular hypothesis and forget about the broader data context at hand. And so what Voyager does is it uses Vega Lite to basically automatically recommend the most suitable visualization. It enumerates all those designs like I showed earlier and ranks them based on, you know, known metrics for what makes a visualization effective and lists them in the gallery. And of course, users can go ahead and, you know, dig in deeper as they want. Now, Vega and Vega Lite have also been deployed to Wikipedia and with the Jupyter Notebook. So we've been very lucky to work with folks both at Wikipedia and core members of the Jupyter team. So for example, there are 800 pages on English Wikipedia that have Vega visualizations in them. Here is just one. This is the most visualization of the most expensive paintings ever sold at auction. And if you're familiar with Wikipedia, you know that, you know, there are just long data tables that I'm not showing you down here, and they're just static, right? They just list all this data. But here is a much more interactive way to explore that data. You can get these thumbnails on hover. You can click legends to see, you know, different painters over time, different periods over time, and things like that, and maybe come up with some new insights that that static table didn't allow. And there's also interest from all the other Python visualization vendors, folks like Matplotlib, Bokeh, Plotly, about adopting Vega Lite as a standard that they might start to render. And we've been seeing really good feedback from the community as well. So Dan Saber in a recent article said that it is this type of one-to-one-to-one mapping between his thinking, the code that he writes, and the ultimate visualization that gets produced that is his favorite thing about Altair, which is the Python library that wraps Vega Lite. And similarly, the Altair team said that they consider Vega and Vega Lite to be our best candidates for principal lingua franca for data visualization, you know, something that we can standardize around as a community. And in this space, I've also been exploring it with a system called Lyra. And it's really motivated by the fact that everything I've been talking about, there's kind of been this fundamental mismatch, right? I've been using these textual specification languages to describe these inherently visual and interactive artifacts. Why is that? We don't sit and program our graphics, right? We don't sit and program our word processing or Word documents and things like that. We do it in a direct manipulation way. And so to demonstrate this tool, I will reuse another New York Times example, this time by Hannah Fairfield. And if you think it's a line chart, I would forgive you. It's not. It's something called a connected scatter plot. What it is showing is the price of the miles driven per capita along the x-axis, the price of gas along the y, and then the path that connects these points is showing you the time series data. Each of the points corresponds to a particular year. And so it's the path that connects them that gives us our time series rather than, time being along the x like we normally see it. So here is Lyra's interface, and you can see that we're reusing a lot of conventions from sort of presentation and vector graphics packages. So we've got a canvas front and center, and that's where most of our interactions will occur. Along the top, we've got a toolbar of our marks and useful utilities, and along the left-hand side are sidebars with visual inspectors for all the various layers and marks and things like that. And so what we do is we start by importing some data. And we load that driving data in. And this data table here allows us to just inspect our data to make sure that it's clean and appropriate, and allows us to apply any transformations to it as well. Now we start by adding a line mark to the visualization. And this way we do data binding is by dragging out cells of that data table. And the second I do that, you'll see that the visualization, the line right now, lights up with these cyan regions. And these cyan regions are called drop zones. Now if I get close to a drop zone, it gets selected, so now it's turned orange. And when I drop it over it, Lyra starts to now infer the default scales and axes and legends and things like that I need. So very similar set of interactions to Tableau, but now in the sort of Vega Lite way of thinking. And these left-hand side visual inspectors give me the ability to start making fine-grained manipulations to my visualization as well. And so just with a few drag and drop operations, I'm starting to get pretty close to Hannah Fairfield's original design. I've not had to write any code. I've not had to even touch JavaScript. All I've had to do are just these drag and drop operations. And so, what's critical about this application is that we're fluidly moving between Vega and Vega Lite. Lyra is using both underneath the hood, but as a user, I don't need to explicitly figure out which one do I use when. I can just move back and forth. Those direct manipulation drag and drops are producing Vega Lite statements, and the visual inspectors give me control over Vega. And I think that's why we've seen some really great feedback in both the user studies. So participants have said, Lyra makes me feel much more in control. That there's a real joy in using Lyra, as well as out in the community. So Lisa Rust, recently an NPR Open News Fellow, said that Lyra is what Illustrator should be for data visualization. And so what I've been showing you is a new version we've been working on in the lab. A beta version that we released several years ago has been in use by about 1,500 people a month, including some journalists and educators. And what we've heard from them is they found Lyra to be really useful to rapidly prototype these ideas, right? They can just drag and drop and create something and evaluate it, talk with their team about it. And then maybe they'll go ahead with the D3 once they've found a really interesting example. And educators have told us this is a great way to start learning about data visualization. You get all those building blocks in an interface. You don't have to worry about any of those implementation concerns. Instead, you can just sort of experiment and see what the effect of manipulating them is. So to recap, the projects I've been describing today have all formed this tool stack. Right at the bottom is Vega, this declarative language for visual encoding and interaction that enable this very expressive design space. Vega Lite, much more concise language, better suited for rapidly authoring and enumerating that design space. And together they enabled this new ecosystem of systems for data analysis and design, one of which we saw right at the end was Lyra, where we could use these drag and drop interactions and move between these levels of abstraction down below. And for the last bit of the talk, I want to briefly touch on, where do we go next? And so the first, really key thing that Vega Lite enables is the ability to really understand what makes effective interactive visualization design. Folks have already done this for visual encodings. We kind of know, length encodings are better than color or opacity and things like that. We have a rough, set of these guidelines for visual encoding. But we don't know any of this for interaction techniques. We don't know when one particular technique might be better than another, for what set of tasks, on what set of devices, in what context, things like that. And so this is where Vega Lite's ability to enumerate that design space comes really handy, because we can begin to empirically answer that question. So we can generate all those designs, maybe classify them based on some sort of analytic task. So here's just a commonly used taxonomy that includes tasks like finding related things, or analyzing a trend, or identifying outliers. And so if we classify all those different designs using these tasks, and then put them in front of users, then we can start running some human subjects experiments and getting a sense of, well, why do people prefer particular interaction techniques and when? And then critically, we can take all of that knowledge and build them into design tools. Because then we're taking all of that knowledge that experts have baked into their brains and are just doing, and make it much more widely available to users. So one easy example, easy from a computer science perspective, I mean, is something called a visualization linter or spell checker, right? So imagine that you were in Lyra, and you're not a visualization expert. Maybe you're making some mistakes. Imagine now that Lyra gave you red wavy lines throughout the interface and said, here's a better color palette to choose, or here's a better data mapping that you might make. Imagine extending that to interaction techniques as well. And we can even imagine sort of higher level ways of designing these interaction techniques, just specifying the task and letting the system synthesize the most appropriate technique for me. Or even sort of the analogy to our drag and drop interactions for visual design, but now for interaction techniques. So can I do interaction design by demonstration? Could I hit a record button and start clicking around the actual visualization and have Lyra start to suggest, well, here's what I think the interaction is you're trying to perform. Starting to take those recommendations and dragging and dropping them. This is just sort of a rough wireframe that I'm showing you here, but it's active research that me and hopefully my future students want to do. And so all of this work that I've been talking about, is, that's what I get for skipping some slides, has been done in concert with, a really phenomenal team of collaborators at the University of Washington. And all of the work I've shown you is free and open source, available at vega.github.io. And with that, I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Rob and Marshall going to kick it off?
Yeah, I can kick it off, Rob, that works. So this is kind of actually on the point that you were just touching on at the end about looking forward.
Yeah.
Really interesting to hear about all of the tools that you created that can empower humans and reduce the amount of work that humans have to do, the amount of coding that they have to do. But just curious, as you look even further into the future, what other capabilities do you maybe see under the umbrella of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other subtopical? Everyone's always talking about
Yeah.
that. But wondering if you see any possibilities, opportunities, or even challenges when you think about this space.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's why I'm spending a year at Google Brain, is to sort of get in the belly of the machine learning beast, right, so to speak. And I think there's sort of a ton of the space of interesting questions here is quite large. So both in how might we use machine learning models in these sort of design applications, right? So a lot of the recommendation stuff that I was showing right at the end there, so systems like Voyager and Lyra, really could benefit from machine learning models that are learning from user interaction over time. So here's we might train our system to make some particular set of interactions, but these design trends change. And we want the system to be reactive to those changes sort of online or live, right? We as tool developers don't want to go back and update the system with every new trend that comes about. particularly because it's often not clear even to the experts when that trend is the right trend, a good thing or not. So one example of this is with narrative visualization online, not even that long ago, the standard or the custom was to use those steppers, like that initial Amanda Cox budget forecast chart that I showed you, right? Step by step, here's this thing that I want to show you. We don't really see those anymore. Instead, we see these scrolly telling visualizations, right? I keep scrolling, and that's how I go step by step, and it's not really steps, it's much more sort of continuous transitions. What we would hope is that our design tools sort of detect those as people are creating them and suggest it to you. Maybe it can go even a step further. So as you're creating, a stepper narrative visualization, maybe the tool automatically sequences out to be a scrolly telling visualization or things like that. So that's one place I think machine learning is useful for. But there's also sort of the inverse of that, where one of the things I'm working on at Brain is to understand how can we use visualization to better understand our machine learning models. Because right now, as more and more of these applications get smarter behind the scenes, to some degree you can imagine that we as users don't really know why are we seeing these recommendations that we are, right? Why is Netflix recommending these movies to me? Is there a way that I can tweak their recommendation algorithm to better tailor those recommendations? Because I know my tastes, presumably, better than the machine learning model does. But maybe not, who knows? So these are all sort of interesting research questions, I think, in that space, yeah. Yeah, Ali?
Yeah, something in what you were just talking about sounded a little bit like, maybe I'm thinking of the wrong paper, but like Ethan's paper, Augur, or maybe it's a different paper, but where he looks at different programming idioms and essentially using the community's generated code to inform kind of the best practices for somebody else that's generating code. And it sounds like you could sort of incorporate that basic premise into this and say, hey, it looks like you're trying to make a scatter plot. This almost sounds like a very smart version of Clippy. Like, it sounds like you're trying to make a scatter plot, and like, would you like to do this or that?
That's right.
So that's just sort of a random thought.
Yep.
But one of the questions that I had as you were talking about Lyra was that you mentioned that people would use Lyra and then kind of use, and then essentially, I guess, like transition over to building something in D3 after doing some exploration. Does Lyra or Vega Lite or anything on that stack kind of generate like essentially D3 code that somebody can build off of, or is that not?
Yeah, so there's no theoretical reason it can't. We just haven't built that compiler because it's not been on our sort of agenda. It's certainly probably the number one thing I want to say that we've seen from the user community, but our hope is that someone in the community will build that for us. It used to be easier to build it, but once we started pushing in the interaction domain, Vega's architecture now is so sort of custom built for these declarative interaction primitives that it might be a little trickier to map them to D3 JavaScript code, but certainly not impossible. But that's sort of the direction I think it's important to continue pushing in, is sort of maintaining the layering of this tool stack. Because the power is being able to go from one layer all the way down and maybe all the way back up, losing some amount of information along the way. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's think about this ecosystem of data storytelling. You obviously need the data, you need tools like this, you need sophisticated folks who can find
know how to use
data and communicate it to others.
Yeah.
Then you need a mass audience that's receptive and curious and interested in these kind of things. Clearly you've solved that tools bucket, or are attacking that this issue from that angle. Where is the next greatest pain point in that continuum of getting data to large? Yeah.
I think I like the buckets that you've drawn, because I think one of them is right now the folks who are communicating in this medium are the experts, right? So it's the journalists talking to the mass audience, and the way the mass audience reacts is still in a purely textual medium, right? It's comments on an article, it's tweets, what have you. And that seems like a shame to me, because on a lot of these data journalism sites like the Upshot or 538 or things like that, sure, the long tail of comments is not great, but there are a lot of really high quality comments that are talking in pretty sophisticated ways about data and yet they're just relegated to, arguing over text. And so I'm very curious about how, we might take some version of these tools and maybe embed them into comment boxes and things like that, and see the effect of maybe opening up discourse to a much broader audience. You can imagine now then that these articles aren't maybe just these one-time products that journalists create, but become these much more living documents that users might start to layer their different interpretations of the data, and other readers might be able to come and maybe slide back and forth. Here's what the journalist was telling me, but here's what someone from a different perspective said, and from the opposing perspective, and you can slide back and forth. There are related questions in there about how might we sort of track everything that has happened to the data at a particular point, right? The journalist has made a whole number of decisions to filter out some data or, aggregate the data, manipulate it in some way. What if we were to, in some fashion, expose those, attach them to the visualization, and then give the user control over them? And so that way the user for themselves, I keep saying user, but really I mean reader, can begin to get a sense of how might different decisions affect that story in the end. And even if that's a little grandiose, certainly tools of that nature we can start using to better educate folks about thinking in terms of data and things like that. Yeah, Anne.
Just to build on that, do you ever see layering on chatbots into this interactivity?
Certainly. I know a lot of folks, not a lot, several folks have been sort of looking at how might we use Slack and Facebook Messenger bots to help people. This goes back to sort of that machine learning question earlier. It's just a better medium for surfacing these recommendations, and how might those interactions change. And so, I know, again, Ethan has been investigating this as well in sort of the data science context. Yes?
Do you have a sense of, when you look at the usability of these particular visualizations, who they cater towards and who these readers are? Because yesterday I was at a separate talk on educating literate news readers, and I found that a long tail of people struggle to read a basic histogram.
Yep.
And I wonder, when you talk about these people in the comments, it seems like that would be a very small audience.
It is.
Do very sophisticated things
Yes.
with these visualizations, but there may be many more readers who prefer to have that story kind of extracted from data. Maybe this is how do you pair those two?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's it's a really well-made point. And to the best of my knowledge, I think we're only slowly starting to fill in that knowledge. So one thing that surprised me is that at least until a few years ago, I guess most newsrooms weren't really doing very sophisticated data analytics on their interactives. They didn't really get a sense of who was engaging, to what degree, how far. And once they did, there was a big sort of debate on Twitter showing when people realized that actually people weren't really engaging with the interactives for the most part. And so then there was this big backlash, maybe we should just do static viz, and then anyway. But the point is well taken, is that we don't quite know right now when these are most effective and why and for what readers, and that's something that I think a lot of this tooling will help us answer, because we can do it much more systematically. The problem so far has been in the broader domain of sort of human-computer interaction. People have thought about what makes an interaction technique effective? What does that mean? But the problem has been that there's not been a very scientific way to study it, because there's not been a way for us to go, great, here are all the different designs we want to experiment on. Instead, it's been like, here's this one design over here that this person created, here's this other design over here, and you don't know how to compare them because they feel very sort of apples and oranges. And so now the hope is, if you can begin to do it in a much more rigorous fashion, you can build that out more systematically. Yeah.
So if you think about a topic that really concerns people, how is the tax plan going to impact me? Something a lot of people in here might be concerned about. And you have a range of these interactives with I mean, I'm just thinking that would be so,
Yep.
that would be so useful.
That's right. And so folks in the visualization community have been studying, a variety of these sorts of questions. So things around, not looking at visualization particularly, but sort of infographics. So if you embellish infographics, does that make the data more memorable to users? The New York Times has been doing this new thing with a lot of their interactives where they elicit a prediction from their readers first for a particular trend, and then layer on the data with little annotation for how accurate you were. And folks in our lab did experiments on that to see if people actually, if that was helpful. Turns out it is. And so that's the sort of work we need to do a lot more of to get a sense of, what are these techniques, how are they, what are they good for, when are they good, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I mean, it's very engaging. It almost becomes like a game.
That's right.
And it's a really good educational tool as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Going a little deeper in terms of how you see data visualization helping on the transparency of algorithms.
That's a good question. Honestly, I don't know that I can go much deeper yet. I've just started at Google, so that's basically my goal, is to understand the role that data viz can play. So I'm part of a team that is behind this new journal for interactive machine learning called Distill. And we just published an article this morning sort of showing how these neural nets build up their representation of images piece by piece. So you go from like these really simple edge detectors to maybe starting to detect the noses of dogs and like the ears of dogs, and then taking those noses and ears and building them into faces, and then dogs' bodies, and so on and so forth. And it's those sorts of techniques that I think we sort of need to explore better before we can start to develop some of this more overarching theory. I think it's still so early days that we don't quite know what that space is. So it's much more in the sort of, and this might just be also because I don't know the space very well yet. So there might be a lot of this work already done, but my sense is that it's much more early, and we just need to sort of explore these techniques before we get a sense of some more higher level knowledge synthesis there. And brain, certainly a lot of folks there are thinking deeply about these problems. So certainly around questions of the fairness of these algorithms and things like that, and finding that you don't need very sophisticated new techniques at all. So there was let me see if I can pull it up. There was an article about All right, well, I'll send it to Anne once I find it. So there was basically an article about machine learning algorithms used to make bank loan decisions, and how should we set that threshold for a cutoff, and fairly simple interactive visualizations that just allowed you to move that threshold back and forth were really powerful in understanding what these models were doing, and not just what the models were doing, but the implications on different populations. And it was a pretty profound, at least for me, experience. Even though with my sort of computer science hat on, I was like, the visualization itself is not sophisticated in any way. And so I think it's better understanding how we apply the sets of things we already have in these new domains. I think another sort of powerful vector to explore.
One last question? Okay, well, thank you. This is
Thank you.